Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another player ranking for season of Big Brother I've done a retrospective of, and here we're doing the player ranking for Big Brother 5. So here I'll be ranking the players of this season based on how I feel like they played on this season, and let's jump right into it. We have 14 players to rank here. At number 14, the person I think played the worst game on this season was actually kind of close. I do feel like it is between two options here. However, I personally end up going with Mike Lebinsky, the first boot of the season, and I kind of debated it with someone else, largely because I feel like Mike is a player that, while I think he did almost everything wrong on this season, I feel like there is a good player in him. I feel like he has a very solid strategic mind for the game. The problem is pretty much everything else. And again, when it came to this player ranking here and just assessing how he played on this season, and the fact that I just disagree with a lot of his approach to the game in relation to this season, obviously has to leave him at the bottom. Where again, strategically, again, he does show some chops. I mean, obviously he does create the backdoor plan, telling it to others to where it's later utilized further into the season. He obviously calls out Jason Scott and has a really interesting campaign strategy, and fully recognizing the fact that Nomus doesn't really matter in his campaign, and it's really more so a battle between him and Jason Scott, and needing people to keep him around to go after Jason Scott. And again, I think he has some very innovative ideas for this time in Big Brother. The problem is, again, socially, he was pretty bad. I mean, he was not well liked by most of the cast. The only people that seemed to kind of like him were Diane and Marvin. He obviously did also just kind of openly target Jason Scott when they were HOH, and that's not particularly great as well. So again, there definitely is a lot of bad here of Mike Lebinsky as well. But again, I do think his strategic mind is something that made me debate putting him higher, but I couldn't quite do it. So he's here at number 14. At number 13, a player that I went down so much on after this latest rewatch. I think this is kind of underratedly one of the worst players of all time, and that person is Holly. And I think Holly is a pretty astronomically bad player, where when we look at her run on this season, I mean, she was safe week 1 because Jace, her showmance, was HOH, in a position where most of the rest of the house found her annoying and didn't want her around. Week 2, she was put on the block by Marvin, someone that had allegiances to the Four Horsemen side of things, and through that essentially was targeting someone that could have potentially been a number for him, to where Holly was dead to rights on the block had she not been taken off of the veto, to which, again, she gets very fortunate that Jace wins the veto and is able to take her off in that instance. And in week 3, she's taken out when one of her showmance's closest allies wins HOH and decides to actively target her over all these other people that are actively coming after him, which is obviously really terrible there. And mixing now the fact that a lot of people just found her annoying, people also assumed she was a lot smarter than what she actually was, and that ended up making her an even bigger target. Also adding in the fact that she was targeted because of this notion that she was controlling Jace, which is something that she couldn't dispel, while also just outright just being a terrible player. I mean, she seems to have no real strategic chops in the game. She seemed to be terrible socially as well. I mean, like, really, I just feel like Holly brings absolutely nothing to the table on this season. The only reason she's higher than Mike is because at least she had the social capital with Jace to save her for 2 weeks. So that's something. But again, overall, pretty bad player here at number 13. Now, number 12, who would have guessed it? We're talking about a person I just mentioned. We have Jace. And Jace is another one that, on the rewatch, Jace just plays this season really terribly. Again, there is some acumen to give to Jace, particularly in the fact that he is in the Four Horsemen Alliance, and again, did have some pretty solid allies at one point in the game. Also, beyond that, he was playing Marvin for a little bit. He obviously had Holly as a really solid number for him. And he did set up this like decent structure around him in week 1. The problem is that he also made himself a massive target for the other side, where by the time of week 2, pretty much half the house was directly coming for him. And while he gets very fortunate with the next few HOHs to where there are people from his side, even then, he's not able to get what he wants done. And even going back to week 1, his targeting Mike is even probably his optimal move. He's targeting someone that has no social capital in the game. And while, yes, Mike is coming for him, pretty much everyone is coming for him. And I think it would have been a better move there to take out someone that is more integrated into the game. While week 2, again, he almost lost Holly, this very important number for him, from Marvin's HOH, someone that he was very closely working with at that point. Week 3, he once again actually loses Holly in that week, in a position where Drew, one of his closest allies, had won HOH, in a position where his own Four Horsemen alliance had agreed on taking out Holly because they wanted to separate the two and felt like Jace was starting to get too enamored with Holly. And again, the fact that he just doesn't have any real control within his own alliance is really terrible. And we get to week 4, where again, he would have been taken out had he not won the veto that week, and even then ends up being on the wrong side of numbers by the time of the vote itself, despite the fact that he had also fractured his relationship with Scott by that point. And then we get to his actual boot week, where again he's backdoored with no real chance to save himself, and the entire house outside of Cowboy is in on this plan to take him out of the game. Again, it is a really bad game. I really don't feel like there's any point in the game to demonstrate any real chops in the social strategy aspects of the game. So while he seems to have the right idea strategically in terms of who to target beyond his HOH week, he's never able to get anything really done with that. So again, I just think Jace played this season almost entirely all wrong, which is why for me, he's here at number 12. Now number 11, we're going to go to a player that I do find myself a bit conflicted on where to put this person, as I do think this person got pretty unlucky with how their boot week worked out. And I do think if they had survived that, they probably would have been in it for the long haul with a very solid structure around them. But also, I don't get the greatest sense that they cared that much about the game to begin with. So at the end of the day, at number 11, I'm going to go Lori. And Lori's a player that, again, I think there definitely is some impressiveness to her game. I do think she had very solid allies. I mean, we see from early on that she has a solid Final 3 deal with Karen and Will, with her seeming very well integrated within that trio. She also has very good relationships with the likes of Diane and Nomus. Even by the end of the season, Diane is still talking about how much she misses Lori. And again, I feel like she just got super unlucky with the HOH result, where Marvin winning HOH was pretty much the worst case scenario, where I think he was pretty much the only person that would have come for her at that point, where even then the dynamic between her and Marvin was just a very awkward one, particularly due to Marvin just being a creep. So again, I think there are things that definitely prop her up, especially when in comparison to a lot of the earlier boots from this season. However, I think the thing that does make me still place her below at least the next person we're going to be talking about is the fact that, well, again, very good socially. I think she really didn't have much of a strategic bone in her body. It did very much feel like the likes of Will and Karen were really running the strategy of her game, where we even see this moment of, again, her almost staying during her boot week, where Will and Karen tell her that she has the votes to stay. And in that instance, it very much feels like Lori had almost nothing to really do with that and was just told about that after the fact. And even beyond that, despite having the votes to stay, Lori still wanted to quit at a point. And was kind of just done with the experience from the very beginning. And it's like, I just don't really get the sense that Lori cared enough to really play the game to where, while yes, there are some very impressive aspects of her game, particularly in the social game. And I feel like if she was in the game for longer, she probably would have been pretty good in challenges as well. I just don't feel like her strategic ability is really there. And along with the fact that I don't think her motivation to really play the game was there. So that's why I do have her here at number 11. Now, number 10, we have a player that, again, I look at in a similar field to Lori. I think in many ways, Lori is probably someone I would look at as the better player, in the sense that I could see Lori doing better on most given seasons if she cared. However, I think this person is someone that I think probably had more gusto on this season. At number 10, I do have Scott. And I think having Scott this high might be a little bit controversial. I think people look at Scott as like a really terrible Big Brother player. And to be fair, he's not good. However, I do think in comparison to the field we've talked about so far, I do feel like Scott is the best of the pre-jurors here. I do feel like, oh yes, he did make a massive target of himself alongside Jace. It really is just that. He is a target because of Jace. It very much feels like, while Scott, again, is pretty bad socially at points to where he does piss people off, gets into arguments for no reason, it still feels like by the time he goes home, he's simply going home due to his relationship with Jace and them wanting to weaken Jace, more so than them actually wanting to get Scott out. It actually feels like Scott was actually pretty well liked socially by the end of it. I mean, you see a lot of people later in the season talking about people who they miss, and a lot of them are missing Scott. And you have a lot of talk during his actual eviction week where people don't want to get rid of Scott, but feel like they have to because of Jace. And again, it very much feels like one of these situations where he's simply being taken out due to how close he was to Jace at this point, and them needing to weaken Jace for the following week when they do plan on taking Jace out. And if Jace had not win the veto during that week, I feel like Scott could have potentially had a decent road ahead of him, still having allies in Drew and Cowboy, still seeming to have relationships with the likes of Marvin, the twins, even Diane. I don't think would have been opposed to working with him, especially once that side of the house really fractures. Like, I think Scott probably had a level of potential on this season had he survived that actual round. But obviously that round just played out pretty terribly for him, to where once Jace won the veto, he was kind of dead in the water. But I still feel like, considering the amount of people that were supporting him around him and how many people just really didn't even actually want him to go, all the fact that he was a very active strategic player early on, to where he was brokering a lot of the deals that the Four Horsemen were making. He makes the most of the situation, and Drew wants to get rid of Holly. He is probably the main strategist of the Four Horsemen, to where I feel like that is at least something, to where, again, out of these pre-jurors here, I feel he was the closest to actually reaching his potential on this season, because that, for me, I have him here at number 10. Now, number 9, and obviously the top 9 here are all the posters, if you can't tell. But at number 9, we have someone that is pretty bad still, and that person is Adria. And straight up, I mean, my opinion of Adria's game actually kind of went up on the rewatch here. I actually feel like Adria's game up to the point where she wins HOH is actually not entirely bad. I feel like while she was a target for the Four Horsemen for her first few weeks due to her physicality, the fact that she was put on the block by Drew in week 3 and ends up surviving that in a position where she's even able to get the remaining Four Horsemen outside of Jace to get on board with keeping her is pretty good work, along with her work in week 4, to where she keeps the Horsemen really snowed and thinking that she's with them. And I do think, even though having your twin in the game is looked at as a benefit, I do think for Natalie and Adria actually kind of screwed them over more than anything. I think it added this bigger target on their back, both through the fact that they're obviously a duo in the game, but also the fact that people thought it was unfair that they were allowed to be in the game, considering the fact that they weren't in the house at all times. And through that, many people looked at it as they had this unfair advantage, not being put into the stressful situation that is being in the Big Brother house at all times. And that put an even bigger bullseye on their back. Or by the time they end up winning HOH, I can understand why they would make a big move in that instance. And even then, I think they were in the right direction at first. Building this twin alliance, working with the likes of Diane and Drew, and also pulling in Cowboy, I feel like that could have been an alliance that really ran the game. But then I feel like the amount of HOH-itis that Adria has during HOH reign is pretty insane. Like, the level of a power trip that she goes on is pretty unprecedented, I feel like, at this point in Big Brother, where she ends up nominating one of her own allies and is upset when they're upset at her for doing so. Along with the fact that she puts him up for just very icky reasons, her saying that God told her to put up Marvin and Will, which is just a really terrible look there. And we have her getting even more power hungry through winning the veto, and then wanting everyone to tie the vote coming into the eviction, and her blindsiding pretty much everybody by taking out Will. It's, again, just a massive power trip there, and it's something that she just never really recovers from. Where beyond that week, I don't think she necessarily plays terribly in the final 8 and final 7 rounds, but it's just all of her social capital is completely sapped by that point, and she had turned these people that were once her allies, which, I mean, to be fair, I don't think they would have been her allies for that much longer after that round anyway, even if she didn't go on her power trip. But it really is just indicative of just how terrible her HOH reign is. And mixing in, again, the fact that I don't think she's the greatest socially. So again, I do feel like Adria just plays her HOH reign all wrong, and while there are good aspects to her game before that, I feel like the end of her game is just so astronomically bad, to where I still have to land her here number 9. At number 8, who would have guessed it? It's her twin. We have Natalie. And straight up, like, game-wise, I don't think there is a massive difference between Natalie and Adria. Like, in terms of this ranking here, I would actually say I probably think Adria would probably have more potential on any given season, where it did seem like Adria is probably a little bit better socially. It felt like Natalie was a little bit more domineering personality-wise, where I could see that getting her into a little bit more trouble than Adria, even though Adria was the HOH that obviously made all the moves that put this massive target on their back. But at the same time, obviously Natalie was in on those moves as well. I think another thing that you could possibly prop up Adria for over Natalie is the fact that Adria is better in competitions, where obviously Natalie never wins a competition, while Adria does. However, again, that's more so for a grander player ranking, how I think of them as players in the grand scheme of Big Brother. I think when in relation to how they played on this season, I am going to put Natalie above Adria, simply for the fact that I think Natalie had much stranger circumstances in the game than Adria, where obviously no one even knew Natalie existed until week 5 of the game, and I feel like that would be a very difficult position to be in, where you now have to first introduce yourself 5 weeks into the game. And mixing that in with the fact that she was also kind of screwed over to the fact that Adria had won the veto, to where she obviously would have had a much better chance of staying if Adria had stayed on the block. Again, I think it's enough to land her above Adria. Now, again, realistically, they're pretty much the same. I don't think there's really that much different between how they play the game, but I think it is those very minor differences that leave me having Natalie higher here, number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that I've always been very conflicted on. I'm probably even more conflicted on this player after my latest rewatch. And at number 7, I do have Marvin. And Marvin is a player that I remember thinking of pretty highly after my previous rewatches, where I remember thinking of Marvin as this person who had a good strategic mind. And while he was a bit rough socially, he was a pretty solid all-around player. However, on the rewatch here, I think he's a lot worse than I remembered. I think physically, yeah, again, he does do well in challenges at points. And socially, again, there are people that he does bond with, but he also is not particularly well liked for a lot of this season, where he kind of just seemed to be kind of dragged through the game, kind of just left in there due to the fact that there's other bigger threats in the game. Well, again, week 1, most of the women in the house absolutely hated him and wanted him out. And he also had some terrible behavior in his own right, where Lori and Holly had reported him in for sexual harassment. He was very rarely ever involved in any alliances in the game, to where, again, while I think strategically you can claim that, okay, he was the one to bring up the 6-finger plan and got that to go through and seemed to have some awareness of the game dynamics at points, he also never really did anything with that outside of just outright survival. He never really has a true path in the game. I mean, even when he was with the 4 Horsemen, again, he was the 5th in the Santa Monica Van Boys, and even then, he was just a very exposable number to them. They talked constantly about wanting to get rid of him. Even in week 2, when he was HOH, they considered talking about potentially getting rid of him the following week. Even in week 3, when Drew's HOH, he had wanted to get rid of Marvin. In week 4, I mean, for a lot of the week, he was looked at as the backup target. In week 5, he was the backup target if they couldn't get Jace out. Week 6, he was the target for the majority of the week until Will kind of put his foot in his mouth. And he ends up staying for the next few weeks due to the twins being a bigger target. But even then, at the final 7, his move to take out Adria just seems extremely misguided. A very personal move. One that he's doing simply because he doesn't like Adria, more so than actually benefiting his game position, which it simply doesn't, as it just leaves him as the very clear target for final 6, where he does end up going home. Again, mixing down the fact that, again, he was hated socially by most of the cast, which I have a tough time believing he would actually win if he got to the end, and just all around, again, I just do not look at him as a good player anymore. I do think he is pretty bad socially, pretty mediocre strategically outside of some minor moments of decent strategic thoughts, and never really truly got anything done in the game that really benefited his position in the game. So again, for me, I don't look at Marvin's game too highly, but he is higher than the people we talk about simply just due to the fact that he made it relatively far in the game, and I feel like Natalie and Adria blew up their games even more than he did. So again, for me, I have Marvin here, number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that made it very, very far into the season, but one that I simply just don't think is a good player. And at number 6, we do have Cowboy. And Cowboy is always a player that I've been very conflicted on, based on the fact that, again, he gets to the end and has 3 votes. Is only 1 vote away from winning the game of Big Brother. And even beyond that, I think there are other situations where he would have had a good chance at winning Big Brother. To where while Cowboy is someone that was very much not respected by a lot of the cast, I do feel like there are definitely situations where he gets to the end and does end up winning, particularly due to the fact that he has the twins' votes in almost every single situation. He has Drew's vote in a decent amount of situations, along with the fact that he also probably has Nomus's vote in a decent amount of situations. So if he had gotten to the end against someone like a Diane or a Marvin, I think he does probably win the game in those instances, despite the fact that he was looked at as this massive GOAT in the game. Now, beyond that, I do feel like Cowboy was kind of just dragged through the game, to where obviously, like, initially he was in the 4 Horsemen Alliance, so obviously didn't really have much power within that alliance. Whenever he brought up a move, they would just instantly shut it down. And he constantly wanted to target Marvin, that was never really successful in getting any of that done. He obviously sticks by the Horsemen as the alliance crumbles, unlike Drew, who obviously finds greener pastures. Now, I will give him a lot of credit for building this really good relationship with the twins, which does boost his position a bit through the middle of the game. But even then, beyond that, he's kind of this perpetual pawn for the next few weeks, to where even Drew does consider taking out Cowboy at points to keep keep in the likes of the twins to help him win challenges moving forward, but obviously that doesn't go through. But I really just don't feel like Cowboy had much strategic agency in the game. I really just felt like he was doing things based on promises he had previously made, whether that be to the Horsemen or specifically to Drew or to the twins. It very much just felt like he was just following in line with whoever he had promises with without actually giving it much strategic thought in his own right. I mean, even his move to go to the final 3 with Diane is pretty ridiculous, where he decides to go to the final 3 with a showmance, overtaking his own sister to the final 3, which again, he claims that was a strategic move he made, which he did it because Nomus was coming after him at the final 5, but also, yeah, she wanted him out at the final 5 because he was against her closest ally, not against Drew, who he would have been against at the final 3. And really just Cowboy, someone that I don't think has much of a strategic bone in his body. I don't think he was someone that was very respected by the rest of the cast. However, I do think he is still a player that, again, had win equity. Again, having situations where he could possibly win. But even then, despite being looked at as a GOAT, he still wasn't even that safe in the game. Where the likes of Diane and Nomus wanted him out at 4. The likes of Nomus and Karen wanted him out at 5. And again, this is despite the fact that no one really thought he had a shot at winning. So again, I don't think Cowboy's that good of a player, which is why I have him here at number 6. At number 5, we're moving on to a player as the earliest boot left on the board here, and here we're moving on to Will. And Will is a player that I very much thought highly of before my latest rewatch. I always remembered him as this person that got very screwed over earlier on in the game. Someone that was kind of running the early game alongside the other women and led this charge against Jace and Scott, though gets kind of unlucky in the fact that Adria ends up turning against him, probably due to homophobic reasons. And to be fair, that aspect of it I still stand by. However, I do think something I am a bit lower on with Will on the rewatch is the fact that, again, he does pretty much openly target the twins during their HOH week, which is pretty stupid to be targeting the HOH in a position where, again, they have the power to get the votes against him, so that was pretty dumb. But beyond that, again, I think he plays a solid game. I mean, he is a pretty decent strategic thinker. I mean, him alongside Karen seem to be two of the bigger players earlier on in the game, where they instantly had this trio with Lori, and then they pulled in Diane, Nomus, and Adria, and really led this charge against Scott and Jace. And again, had he survived his boot round, I think he would have been in a really strong position. And even when he gets taken out, I mean, a lot of the game for the next few rounds was largely revolved around his elimination, where essentially the likes of Nomus, Karen, and Diane really weaponized his elimination to paint this bigger target on Natalie and Adria that was pretty inescapable for them following this. I do think is the fact that he built these really strong bonds to a point where his elimination caused these really major ripples in the game following this, I think is pretty impressive, pretty indicative of how strong those relationships were. And again, had he survived, I think he would have been poised to make it pretty far. I mean, I think he would have probably been running a lot of the game following that alongside Karen and Nomus. I mean, the fact that he essentially won the battle for Diane's vote in a position where Diane should have been siding with the other side of things, especially at that point in the game, I think is, again, another impressive aspect of his game. I think Will is still a very underrated player. I mean, he is very good socially. I mean, the fact that he is able to build these really strong bonds, these people around him, had about half the cast there really just adoring him, and even out of the outsiders, I mean, he still had pretty good relations with the likes of Drew and Marvin, and he seemed like a pretty competent strategic thinker. And I just think Will is a pretty solid all-around player that just got kind of screwed over earlier on. Though, again, I do feel like the fact that he targeted twins so openly was pretty bad. But outside that, again, I think a pretty good player, and he's here number 5. Now number 4, and here obviously the top 4 end up being 4 of the top 5. All right, number 4 here, I'm going with the person that is probably the person that has one of the better reputations of this grouping. Though I've always found this person to be a bit of an overrated player. Not number 4, I'm going with Nomus. And again, Nomus is someone that I think my appreciation for her game kind of went up a little bit through the rewatch. Now, I think the things I criticize of her game, I still stand by. I do think the 6-finger plan is very overrated in terms of Nomus's role in that. I think she was simply just the HOH that was able to get it through, more so than her actually having much to do with the formation of the idea of it. And really, the entire house was in on that plan in terms of the execution. So I really don't give her much credit really at all for it. Well, beyond that, I do think she is someone that I would look at as a pretty inconsistent player. I don't think she would be able to do what she does on this season in every cast, where I do feel like she's the type of player that needs to have these specific personalities in the house for her to gel with to do well in the game, along with the fact that I do feel like she's a bit too loyal in the game. where I think she's a bit too trusting of people. We saw that with her relationship with Diane in particular, where she really was kind of aloof to what Diane was doing, while Karen obviously exactly knew what she was doing. And I think those are major downsides for Nomus' game. Though Nomus was obviously still in a pretty strong spot for a lot of the game. I mean, she played the middle pretty well earlier on, where the likes of Jace and Scott thought they had her as a number, while she was obviously working with the women's side of things. She obviously ends up getting herself within the core of the Will and Karen alliance, essentially taking over Lori's spot in the weeks after her eviction. And while she does end up losing Will, again, I do think Nomus does really effective work in painting this bigger target on the twins. Now, again, how much of that was active strategic gameplay? Not entirely sure. I do feel like a lot of it was just her being emotionally hurt by the fact that the twins went against them, to where that's why they painted a target on their back, more so than it being purely about strategy. But she still does it and does effectively get the twins out back to back, all by somehow avoiding being targeted at the final 6 by Drew, which I think the fact that Drew ends up going for Marvin over the likes of Nomus and Karen is pretty impressive there. Though obviously your game crumbles at final 5, though even then it is a bit of an unlucky circumstance, where obviously it's a circumstance where Diane was allowed to work with Drew and Cowboy in the veto comp. Where had that not been allowed, more than likely Cowboy goes home that week, and through that Nomus is in a much better spot to potentially win to make it further in the game. I do feel like I worry about her in terms of win equity, though, especially considering her plan was to go to the end of Karen, who I think she just outright loses against, and even then against the likes of Diane and Drew, I do think it would be pretty tough. And again, she probably just barely beats Cowboy if she gets the end with him. So I do think win equity, her game's a little bit rocky, but again, I think there are good aspects to her game. Again, the way she was able to play the middle earlier on, the way she was able to build this really strong bond with Will and with Karen, and the fact that she was able to get into this in-game position where she was pretty poised to make it to the end if Diane did not win that veto is pretty impressive. But I do think there are a number of holes with her game. Again, her blind loyalty to Diane, her wonky win equity, that does for me leave her behind the next 3 we'll be talking about. So for me, she's here number 4. Now number 3, and I will say these top 3 were very, very close. I do feel like these 3 all play very different games, but are all really strong games. I think they all have very different pros and cons. And what is a bit of a surprise to me, at number 3, I'm going to go with Karen, which I did not expect to be at number 3 coming into this. Again, I expected her to be at number 2, as I do think Karen is someone that is constantly talked about as a very underrated player of Big Brother. And I would stand by that. I do think in the grand scheme of things, she is an underrated player. Now, in terms of how she played on this season, I think there are a lot of pros, but there are definitely still some cons. I do think the pros for Karen's game, I think she is one of the best social players in the show's history up to this point. I think she is someone that is able to masterfully articulate the social game in her DRs in a way that, again, I think very few people understood up to this point. I think she has this understanding of the game that you very rarely see in old school Big Brother. I think her jury management is pretty unmatched. I think the way that she's able to really resonate with people on their way out is, again, very impressive. I do think if she had gotten to the end, she is a very, very likely winner against most people, mostly due to how well she did with jury members on their way out, particularly the likes of Natalie and Adria, the likes of Marvin, obviously already having the votes of like Will and Nomus. Probably would have had Diane's vote in most situations. Like, I think Karen is a player that if she had gotten to the end, she would have had a lot of win equity. And even in the game, again, she was very good socially, to where she had these very strong bonds in the game. Again, she had this super close relationship with Lori early on, to where despite Lori not even wanting to stay in the game at one point, she was able to get the votes for Lori to stay. She obviously had the really close relationship with Will. She built this really close relationship with Nomus, where Nomus was 100% loyal to her towards the end game. She was one of the only people to still maintain these relationships with the twins after they blew up their games. She also had these relationships with the likes of Jace and Scott, to where they always looked at Karen as someone that could potentially get as a number. I think from that point of view, there's a lot to like from Karen's game. But now for the issues. And I think for me, my biggest thing is I don't get the sense that Karen is the best strategic player in the world. While she's not entirely bad, I do feel like there are many points in the game where I don't fully agree with her strategic decision making. Again, while she is one of the people that did really cultivate this mindset that we need to get the twins out, I don't think that was a mindset that really benefited her that much, especially once they were split up. I mean, getting rid of Adria at the final 7 was something that didn't really benefit her game at all, and she had a lot of agency in getting that to happen. I think 100% the move for her would have been to try to get the likes of Drew or Diane out. Also, I think beyond that, the fact that she was seemingly targeting Diane more so than targeting Drew, I think is pretty misguided. To where while she is someone that did clock Drew's game and talk about how much of a threat Drew could be, she never actually does go for him. And instead, again, by the end game, at the time of the final 5, she was more so on the bandwagon of wanting Diane out over Drew, which seemed to me misguided, when I feel like Drew was a much bigger jury threat to her in particular. And also, while I do think she gets screwed over in the way that she goes out, and the fact that Diane was, again, able to work with Drew and Cowboy to win the veto that she won, I also feel like it does fully demonstrate this, like, mismanagement of her relationship with Diane, to where I think the fact that Diane was so readily willing to cut her in that instance, I think really just shows you her not being able to cultivate this relationship with Diane. I think a truly elite player would have been able to do. I mean, she gets taken out essentially because she was so close to Nomus and Diane wanted to split them up. Though again, I think there were definitely still arguments for her to make that could have easily kept her. I mean, separating Drew and Cowboy would have been something that would have been very beneficial for Diane, essentially giving Drew no other option but to take her to the end. And the fact that she wasn't able to utilize that to her benefit, I think is something to knock against Karen as well. And again, I think there's definitely good and bad things about Karen. I think she definitely is an understated player in Big Brother history. But I think in relation to this game, I do feel like the other two just played better all-around games than Karen, despite the fact that Karen, again, had a lot of win equity on this season. But for me, I do have Karen here number 3. Now number 2, and straight, these top 2 obviously are very messy players, despite being so high here. I mean, both of them, and while having impressive games in the grand scheme of things, still definitely have a good chunk of flaws, probably more flaws than the likes of Karen. Though also both end up outplaying Karen by the end. But at number 2, the one we're going to go with here is Diane. And again, for me, the debate between Diane and Karen was very, very close. I do think it's one that I would have gone the opposite before my latest rewatch. However, I do feel like Diane, while her end game is very sloppy, and there are moments of her game that do come off as very emotional, I do feel like Diane is still a pretty solid player of the game. I think especially at this point in Big Brother, I think it's probably one of the better active strategic players in the game. While again, she can be a very messy player, where I think her entire end game, final 5 on, is a bit of a mess, to where, again, like, her targeting Karen, I think it's something that is looked at as this very, like, big strategic move. And while it is, I think it's one that you could argue was not the right move for her to make. Now, I'm personally fine with it as long as she could also take out Cowboy at final 4, but I do think she's someone that, again, needed to get rid of Cowboy before the final 3 to make sure that Drew takes her to the end. And the fact that she fails at doing so, I think, kind of makes the Karen move look a bit worse to me, where I think in retrospect, she probably would have had a better shot had she voted out Cowboy over Karen and just work alongside Drew to take out Karen at 4 and get into a pretty perfect final 3 situations where both people are taking her, and she would at least have a shot at both of them. Though I think that brings us to the other thing, in the fact that I think her win equity is a bit up in the air. Now, against Drew, I do think it is very close. I mean, Diane herself claims that she would have won, while I've seen other people claim that Drew would have won. I do think it is very close. Now, I think I lean towards Drew beating Diane, but I think it is still an extremely close vote, where I think Drew has locked in Cowboy, Natalie, and Adria, while I think Diane probably has Marvin based on his exit press. But I do think the votes of Will, Nomus, and Karen were very much up in the air, and I definitely could see a world where they all go Drew, especially considering the fact that I think they did not love the fact that Diane ended up betraying them for the likes of Drew. So I think in that instance, again, I could very much see a Drew win, even against Nomus. I do think Nomus has the upper edge due to, again, Diane just completely burning her relationship with the twins, and Nomus having better relationships with the likes of Will and Karen, and also probably having Cowboy in that instance. You also have Diane versus Cowboy, which I also think is very much up in the air due to the fact that I think Cowboy has Natalie and Adria, potentially has Nomus, and it could potentially get Drew as well. Again, like, I think Diane's win equity is just very, very rocky. But I think the thing that really makes me prop up Diane's game is the fact that I think her game up to the end game is actually very impressive. Like, I think for this point in Big Brother, like, while again, she is a pretty emotional player at points, she's someone that, again, had some pretty poor jury management, definitely onto arguments and stuff, I do feel like she still was able to position herself pretty well at points. Again, she was initially in the middle between the 4 horsemen and the Will, Karen, Lori side of things, and while she eventually does become a big target for for the Horsemen. She still had the relationship with Drew that was probably going to keep her safe, along with the fact that she was actually able to manipulate Drew in week 3 to put Holly on the block, and essentially save her entire alliance from that singular move. And after that is obviously involved in taking out Jason Scott. She comes into the Adria HOH in a masterful position, being right in the center of the house, still having the connections with Will, Nomus, and Karen, while also having very good relationships on the opposite side of things, having this pre-established relationship with Adria and Natalie, essentially being their closest ally at that point in the game, though that obviously changes through the week, but then also having the relationship with Drew, and definitely having this option of creating this twin alliance that largely fractures due to her own doing, which again, a little bit questionable. I do feel like Diane's better move was to stick with Natalie and Adria's over the Will, Karen, Nomus's, but even then, even after she makes that move, she's still in a pretty good spot where she is essentially the third in the Karen Nomus alliance, to where they end up leading the charge, getting rid of the twins following that, while still keeping Drew safe in the game. Now, again, at the end of the day, her biggest downfall at the end is her just being too trusting of Drew. Her still believing that Drew would take her to the end in an instance where obviously he cuts her. Now, again, the reports are the fact that supposedly Drew was going to take her until the last second, until she got drunk previous night and told him about all the jury votes she had, which, again, I don't know if it's actually the reason why Drew didn't take Diane, considering Drew was just playing both sides by that point. And to me, it kind of just seems like an easy story for Drew to tell. But again, even if that is bad. But really, it's bad from both fronts. It's bad if she did do that, as she literally just blew up her game at the last second. It's bad if she didn't, as even then, it's the fact that Drew is never fully loyal to her anyway. So again, I think there are definitely conflicting messages with Diane's endgame in particular, but I think her positioning earlier on is actually really impressive. I do really like how influential she was early on in the game. Again, her getting Holly on the block, her getting Natalie and Adria to put up Will to begin with. And while she backtracks from that and ends up burning her relationships with Natalie and Adria, and proceeds to also further burn her relationships with the likes of Marvin and Karen on the way out, to where they're pretty angry at her at the time they leave the house. Again, it's not good jury management at all, but I do feel like positioning the house along with her very aggressive gameplay style is one that I do find pretty impressive to see on this season. So because that, for me, she's here number 2. And at number 1, the best player from Big Brother 5 is unsurprisingly the winner in Drew. Now, I will say my opinion of Drew's game through the rewatch has actually gone down a bit. I do feel like Drew's game is a bit sloppier than I remembered, where while I do always remember the fact that, okay, he only won in a 4-3 vote, I actually feel like that is something I don't really demerit him that much for at this point, considering one of those votes is obviously Nomus, who was always going to vote for Cowboy in that instance, considering she voted for him just because he was her brother, while otherwise Natalie and Adria also really wanted Drew to win too, and would have voted for Drew in most other situations. It was just against Cowboy that they didn't vote for him. It's like, that's something I remember docking him points for. I don't really dock him that many points for it nowadays. I feel like the things I do dock him points for, though, is really his very questionable strategic game. Now, for Drew, I always looked at him as a very well-rounded player, a great social, strategic, and physical player. I think after the rewatch, I would still stand by. He is, again, a very good physical competitor. Again, won 4 HOHs, the record at the time. He is a very good social player. I think the relationships that he was able to build in the game were very strong. He was very much in the center of the house early on, where despite the fact that he was aligned with the 4 horsemen, he still was able to cultivate a lot of these relationships with the other side of the house, to where they still looked at him as someone that could be worked with. Now, obviously, by the time the Jace round, he's able to fully go to the other side and be welcomed in there, and even then is able to cultivate this potential twin alliance with Diane, Adria, and Natalie. And even when that doesn't go through, he still has this relationship with Diane that keeps him really safe in the game. Again, I think socially, he does very good work. I mean, the fact that he was never put on the block until Final 5, and even then, he wasn't actually even the target, where Cowboy was actually going to go home instead, is really insane. However, again, strategically is the part of the game that I'm a bit more hazy on with Drew, where, again, obviously he does have the killer instinct at the end to cut Diane when he thinks that Diane's going to beat him. That's something to give him credit for. He also has the gusto to go against what a lot of the house wanted him to do, in siding with Natalie and Adria and voting out Will, which is something that greatly benefited his game. He also was obviously involved in this twin alliance. He had this wherewithal to realize he needed to jump off the sinking ship that was the 4 horsemen. However, he also has poor play beyond that. Again, like the fact that he puts up Holly in week 3 is still ridiculous. And while it does gain in favor with the other side, it's still a position where his entire intention of that was to still remain loyal to the horsemen and actually benefit the Horseman, when in doing so, he's really just sinking the Horseman. Also, his following HOH of targeting Marvin, I think it's a bit misguided. Again, when he has the likes of Nomus and Karen still in the game, who are bigger jury threats and also people that are clearly going to take each other, I think personally I would have gone for them. Now, again, I think there's still an argument for Marvin being the target, considering Marvin was someone that at that point in the game had been talking about targeting Drew and Diane. But again, I just feel like Marvin had no real agency in the game, to where I personally would have looked at Nomus and Karen as a bigger threat at that point. But even then, I mean, again, it's still up in the air on whether or not he actually was going to take Diane to the end or not. Which, I mean, to be fair, again, as I mentioned, I think he probably still beats Diane very narrowly. But I think based on how the perception was inside the house, it shouldn't have been a question that he would take Cowboy. And again, there is talk about him wanting to take out Cowboy earlier in the game at Final 7, Final 8, where he does consider taking out Cowboy to keep the twins around, which I don't necessarily think is entirely misguided play, but I do think it adds the notion that if Drew needed to, he would have cut Cowboy. Try to take his shot against Cowboy was definitely better than that of Diane. But again, I think the things that are impressive about his game is his social work. Again, the fact that he really ends up getting Diane to be so blindly loyal to him, to where despite him putting her on the block at multiple instances, she still fully believes that he's going to take her to Final 2 and puts all of her eggs in his basket, to where instead of getting to a Final 3 that is very beneficial towards Diane and getting to the end with Drew and Nomus, they instead get to the end with Drew and Cowboy, where Drew is guaranteed to make it to the end and is essentially guaranteed to win by that point. And really, just in general, I think Drew is a massive jury threat on this season as well, to where, while again, he barely beats Cowboy, and I think he barely beats Diane if she gets to the end, where a lot of votes there are a little bit up for grabs, I do think he handily beats someone like Nomus. I do think Cowboy would have voted for him over Nomus. I think he would have also had Diane and Natalie and Adria. I think he definitely beats the likes of Marvin. I think he really beats everyone in the end game outside of possibly Karen. Even then, I think there's an argument for it, where I think against Karen, he would at least have Cowboy and Diane, with a shot at getting Marvin and also a shot of still getting the twins. So again, I do think Drew's win equity on this season, despite the fact that it looks kind of bad by the fact that he barely beats Cowboy, is actually pretty strong. So again, overall, I think Drew is a very solid player on this season. I do think he plays a pretty impressive game, to where, while there are strategic missteps at points, I do think he still has impressive aspects of his game. The fact that he was able to play the middle the most out of anyone on the Four Horsemen side of things. The fact that he really takes advantage of the fracturing within the majority alliance during the Adria HOH and is able to get Will out, which greatly opens up the game at that point in the game. He also cultivates this really strong relationship with Diane that really keeps him safe for a lot of the middle portion of the game, and is obviously able to cut Diane at the very end. Again, it's a very impressive game on paper, so despite some strategic missteps at points, I do come out of this still thinking Drew played the best game of this season. Again, having a lot more win equity than the likes of Diane, also being essentially able to outplay the likes of Karen towards the end of the game. Again, to me, out of these like big players from this season, I feel like Drew's is the one that I do look at as the highest by the end of it, so that's why he's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Big Brother 5. Now, obviously, moving forward, I'll do a similar thing to this for Big Brother 6 the following year, along with other random seasons of reality television I end up covering along the way, so stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.